Welcome back to Part 2 of Lecture 1. Throughout the semester, we will be exploring both endogenous and exogenous factors that influence local and regional economic performance and development. Exogenous factors are those that are external to the region. For example, if a firm located in Fairfax is doing business with companies in the United Kingdom who are impacted by Brexit, that would be an external factor affecting the Fairfax economy. National policies and sometimes state policies are also exogenous at the local and regional level, as are most tech innovations. Endogenous factors are those that are internal to the region. Examples of endogenous factors could include the education attainment levels of the local workforce, local tax rates, the presence of key infrastructure, and the institutional capacity of local government. We will spend a good bit of time exploring endogenous growth factors since these are the things that can be influenced at the local and regional level. Let's look at some of the factors that influence site location decisions for firms in the United States. Site location factors, which we will cover in more detail in Chapter 5, are the characteristics and features that companies consider when choosing a location for investment. The trade magazine Area Development has been surveying corporate executives for more than 30 years, asking them to rate the importance of a wide range of characteristics in their site location decisions. There's a separate survey of site location consultants that we will cover in Lesson 5 as well. The survey is available at the website shown on the slide. There is an important caveat to this survey. If you look at the figure in the lower right corner of the slide, Area Development shows the distribution of survey respondents by industry sector. Over 50% of the respondents come from manufacturers. Manufacturers represent less than 10% of U.S. employment, so the sample is highly biased compared to the general population of businesses. However, economic development strategies are greatly overweighted towards manufacturing because they are typically export-based businesses. An export-based business sells most of their goods and services outside the region, which effectively brings new money into the local economy. Non-export businesses provide mostly services to local businesses and consumers, which just recirculates existing money. We will define and explore the export and non-export dynamics of economic development planning in later lessons. With the focus on export-based businesses, the sample bias in the weighting of the responses is not a concern in using information from the Area Development Survey for strategic planning purposes. So to quickly go through some of the top 20 factors. Highway accessibility simply relates to the business's ability to receive and ship materials and products efficiently. Highway accessibility can also be a factor for getting workers to and from a large office building. The availability of skilled labor is just what it sounds like. Is there a pool of workers within the commuting distance who possess the skills and qualifications your business needs to be successful? And how much will that labor cost you? Here is the balance. Because the cost of living is usually higher in large cities, you would expect businesses to prefer smaller communities or even rural areas where cost of living are lower and therefore the cost of labor is cheaper. But the key concern is labor availability. If the needed workers are not available, it does not matter how low the average local wage would be. Quality of life ties specifically back to the availability of labor. It can also be related to the willingness of key company leaders to move to a given city. Occupancy and construction cost deals with business startup cost. How much will it cost to construct the building you need or adapt an existing building for your business activities? Energy availability and cost deals mostly with electric power. You can't locate a data center just anywhere. There has to be sufficient capacity in local electric power transmission facilities and at a rate that allows you to be competitive in your market. Tax exemptions are incentives provided to companies to get them to move to town, or perhaps to get them to not move away. Proximity to major markets relates to your ability to competitively serve your customer markets. Right to work deals with union memberships. In a right to work state, you cannot be forced to join a union to get a job, even if a union represents workers at that company. In general, labor costs in right to work states are lower, and there is less threat to a non-union company having their workers convert to union representation. Virginia is a right to work state, though some state legislators are wanting to change that. This issue is given more symbolic weight than it probably deserves. But it is likely that Virginia changing their right to work status would cause some employers to move their operations across the border to North Carolina or perhaps Tennessee. The availability of existing buildings is important for companies who do not want to go through the time or expense of constructing a new facility. While I was doing site location work, we always wanted to move into an existing building. Fast track permitting is a process that allows the business to move quickly into their structures or to occupy an existing building. State and local incentives, appearing again in the list, is an extension of tax exemptions, but presumably includes non-tax incentives like grants, gifts, or publicly provided worker training. Shipping costs, of course, relate back to market accessibility. For some companies that operate just-in-time inventory programs, where you don't store much spare materials for doing your manufacturing processes, the raw material is delivered just at the time you need to use it. But because of risk delays, your suppliers need to actually be located pretty close by. Anheuser-Busch requires the companies that make the bottles for their beer to be stored in to locate a manufacturing facility or at least a warehouse within a few miles of their breweries as a condition of purchase. The availability of financing can seem somewhat confusing given modern banking patterns. I believe this really addresses the degree to which the locality has banking institutions with which the business can develop a relationship to more readily address their financial needs. Some smaller communities may not have that resource. In Chapter 1, we provide a figure showing economic factors by spatial scale. In some ways, these mirror the area development factors, but also include some additional items that are usually not top of mind to business executives. Our spatial typology is meant to illustrate the geographic parameters of the characteristic, but also suggest the appropriate spatial scale for governance. On-site facilities include things like having water, electric, and natural gas connections already available. Development approval is site-specific because plans for individual buildings are separately assessed and approved by local government. Land cost is specific to a given property and reflects property conditions that can be physical or regulatory. An example of a regulatory condition would include the presence of a public or utility easement. An easement means someone has the right to use part of your property without further permission or compensation for that specific area of your property. It is not uncommon, say, for a residential lot to have an utility easement that allows the electric or cable company to run their line across your property. If you build a fence or other structure on that easement, it can be removed or destroyed without compensation to provide access to that particular utility line. Is the parcel shaped well for the intended use? It is not efficient to put a square building on a triangle-shaped piece of property. Is the property severely sloped, requiring special treatment or building design? Does the soil have the proper load-bearing characteristics? So how deep is the bedrock? What is the soil stability, and others? The built environment is a phrase more often used outside the U.S. This term refers to man-made structures, facilities, and features that together form an environment in which people work and live. This factor can be as simple as having pleasant surroundings, or can be more complicated in terms of compatibility of uses across properties. Accessibility of networks can be mostly readily thought of in terms of communication networks, such as wireless telecommunications infrastructures or connectability to fiber optic lines. But it can also mean transportation networks, such as accessibility to a railroad service. Zoning is local regulations dictating what type of activity can be conducted on a piece of property. We will cover this in detail in Chapter 10. Zoning applies to an individual site, but is more broadly applied. There will be an area that will be zoned for industrial buildings. Another area of town may be for offices, while others are for retail or residential properties. Tax policies and incentives are city or county-wide. Though you can have incentives targeted to a specific zone, you wouldn't usually see incentives applied to a particular parcel of land. Chambers of commerce are usually tied to a given city or county, or collection of cities and counties, but generally are meant to represent a specific locality or region. Place marketing is done mostly to align with taxing jurisdictions, though this does not necessarily apply to talent attraction, as will be discussed in a later slide. Political influence is typically based on local constituencies. Quoting the late great Thomas Tip O'Neill, who was Speaker of the U.S. House for many years, all politics is local. Community leadership is just that. It's community-based. It is not site-specific, but could be neighborhood-specific or on a broader city scale. Institutional capacity refers to the quality of local governance structures, mostly. It could also refer to locally oriented trade groups or even worker unions. So, for example, the local of a national union. The wider area has somewhat variable dimensions. It is beyond the boundaries of a locality, but smaller than a labor shed or functional economic area. Community strategic planning could be done at the city level, but the scale of the planning would vary depending on the nature of the project or the scale of the plan. If you're building a regional shopping mall, which is probably not the case since shopping malls seem to be going the way of the dinosaur, but if you were, the planning exercises should include the community that would be, say, impacted by traffic around the mall, and that would be regardless of the city boundaries. Business incubation and entrepreneurial cultural development recognizes a level of geographic convenience, close enough for regular direct person-to-person engagement. Infrastructure is included here because roads, water pipes, and the like cross city boundaries. And this, of course, extends into network capacity issues. Here we see housing mentioned for the first time. The wider area is not the extent of the local commuting shed, but is one where we start talking about the relative availability for housing for having workers in near proximity to their place of work. Regional, as defined here, is equated with labor sheds. So think of a metropolitan region. Last time I looked, there were about 2,000 people who commute from Prince William County, which is west of Fairfax, to Prince George's County, Maryland, which is on the other side of DC. Certainly not a fun commute. In talent attraction, we want the person to bring their skills to employers across the region. We don't necessarily care which jurisdiction they decide to live in. airports, at least major commercial airports, serve regions. Another example, though, of major infrastructure we illustrate by this map on the right-hand side of the slide that shows the fiber optic network that forms the backbone of some of our internet connectivity in Northern Virginia across the state of Virginia. The presence of supportive businesses means companies who are vendors or customers, and in this case, mostly vendors. Now, this of course applies for services and products where geography matters. For example, your accountant doesn't need to be located next to you. But what we see is that you wind up getting an increased level of attractiveness if you have a wide range of supportive businesses in your locality before a company decides to move there. Cluster development is more complicated, and we will cover this in detail later, but clusters are more than just a matter of supply chains of vendor networks. They address cross-firm and cross-industry synergies and knowledge transfers that enhance the overall competitiveness of a group of firms. Political influence and institutional capacity mean the same thing as they did in our previous slide, but this is applied to a more regional level. For example, the Northern Virginia delegation to the state government sometimes acts in unison on a particular initiative. Institutional capacity at this scale can also be represented by a metropolitan planning organization who do most of the transportation planning for a region. It could also include cross-governmental bodies like a Council of Governments or even a business group like the Northern Virginia Technology Council. At the national level, the economic factors are determined mostly by the federal government, quasi-independent entities like the Federal Reserve Bank, or government-sponsored enterprises like Freddie Mac, who underwrites and invests in home mortgages in the U.S. These are all exogenous factors from the local perspective. As you can see, the factors that affect site location decisions and the actors who influence those factors at varying levels of geography make the task of understanding economic development processes very complicated. As we move through our topics this semester, we will cover many of these factors at varying levels of detail. By the end, you will have a comprehensive view on how we can shape economic development and economic opportunity to make our neighborhoods, towns, and cities great places to work and to live. Please move on to part 3 of this lecture.